I'm going to begin, though, by posing a question, which is, what does the British government believe that it is doing? What is our foreign policy? Does Gordon Brown have a foreign policy? Does David Cameron have a foreign policy? The United States appears to have a foreign policy. President Obama currently is going through a strategic review in which various dignitaries, chief amongst whom is Richard Holbrooke, the new super envoy for Afghanistan, and they are going to review which will eventually conclude what they should be doing in that country. Somewhat peculiarly, in the course of the review, in fact, at the 20-day stage of the 60-day review process, they decided to deploy 17,000 more troops into Afghanistan. Quite sure how that ties into the whole notion of a strategic review. You just deploy the troops, and then you have a sort of think about whether or not that's a good idea afterwards. But nevertheless, there's something going on there. Whereas we seem, as far as I can gather, to be waiting for what the Obama administration may decide, and then we're just going to jump in behind them. We need to take a serious look at the limits of our power, the limits of our knowledge, and the most importantly of all, the limits of our legitimacy. Since 2005, there has been a growing sense that what was lacking in Afghanistan was resources. There was a story that we had been distracted by Iraq. And this, of course, is a very attractive story because it allows you to criticize George Bush for something else, right? George Bush is not only all the things that we think George Bush is, but he's also destroyed Afghanistan by distracting us towards Iraq. And the theory there, presumably, was something along the lines of, had we been able to deploy all the billions of dollars that was spent in Iraq, and had we been able to deploy the 150,000 troops deployed in Iraq, things would be substantially better in Afghanistan. And you could see this argument beginning in 2004, 2005, when policy journals began to compare investment in Afghanistan to per capita investment in Bosnia or Kosovo. So you could have made another argument. You could have said, indeed you could say today, that the United States is spending twice as much in Afghanistan as it's spending in the whole of Latin America. It's a huge amount of investment into Afghanistan. Or you could say, by comparing it to very small populations such as those in the Balkans, that we're spending less than a quarter or a fifth of what we spent in the Balkans. Two kinds of narratives are presented. One of them is clear, hold, build. Right? The story is you go into an Afghan town, you clear out the Taliban, you stop them from coming back in again, and then you allow the indigenous forces of economic development and governance to flourish. You train up the Afghan National Army and the Afghan National Police, and you leave. It's a clear whole build. The second view, which is slightly more cynical, is that General Petraeus doesn't think he can do that. That in fact what General Petraeus is trying to do is to whack the Taliban hard, because he doesn't think they'll come to the negotiating table at the moment because they don't have any reason to negotiate. So that the theory is really the same theory that Henry Kissinger had in 1968 in relation to Vietnam. In other words, you increase the number of troops, you whack the Viet Cong come to the table in Paris, and although they take over the country, eventually they do so in a fashion that's much more palatable to us, right? Which of these two theories General Petraeus is pursuing, I'm not clear, but I was in Baghdad last week, and I am very struck by the differences between the two situations. In Baghdad, my sense is that the Sunni tribal groups were really parts of Saddam's government. He had a very strong organic connection between the central state, the Ba'athist state, and these tribal chiefs. They were accustomed to dealing with the central government. They were fighting primarily because they were worried they were going to be living in a Shia Ayatollah super state. And they wanted to ensure that the Sunni had a strong and powerful voice in that state. They fought, and by and large, they achieved to some extent their goals, because they were able in 2006 to say, enough already, arm us, 85,000 people, guns, power, we'll run these areas, we'll turn away from al-Qaeda, and in the face of opposition from the Shia government, they managed broadly to achieve those things. So those Sunni tribal groups are quite different from the Afghan tribal groups. Different in a number of ways. One of them is that Afghan tribal groups, insofar as they continue to exist in southern Afghanistan and haven't been destroyed, firstly by the communists and then by the jihad, are tribal groups in a more traditional sense. Their relationship to the central state is very, very uncertain. They're not actually artificial instruments of the central state. If anything, their very existence, models, and modes of life question the validity or the legitimacy of the central state. Secondly, it's far from clear that they're coming to us in any way at all. They're not coming and saying, give us guns, give us money, we'll take on the Taliban. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, the difference lies not so much just in the enemy, in the insurgents, but in the government itself. Al-Maliki's government is backed by a mass political process. You go to any Iraqi town in southern Iraq, and you say, who's in charge? And pretty soon you come across somebody who's wearing a shirt buttoned up to the collar with no tie, who presents themselves as the head of Dawah, or the head of the Majlis Ahla, or the head of the Sadarin. And in every case, these are people who can mobilize 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people in the streets with huge banners. In Afghanistan, there are no street demonstrations because there are none of these political parties. These politicians do not exist. You go to an Afghan town, you say who's in charge, and you're probably dealing with 6 or 7 people who might or might not include a balance of power between a local tribal chief, a mullah, a malik, a jihadi commander, and maybe a police chief or a sub-district governor. But there are no mass political parties, and Karzai's government has none of that depth or legitimacy which allows eventually al-Maliki to cut a deal with the Sunni tribal groups. For these reasons, when we talk about bringing the Taliban to the table, I question, to fall back on Descartes, whether there is a table at all.
Of those two options, take, hold, build, and whack the Taliban so hard that they have to do a deal, is either of those two options achievable? Are either of those two approaches winnable in your view?
I think the answer is I don't think either of those approaches are achievable. I have no reason to believe that we have the capacity, the competence to do those things. I think the Afghan security forces, despite improvements in the army, are not up to the job. I think we, as the international community, don't really know very much about rural Afghanistan. I don't think the military is likely to be able to clear, hold, build. Let's start with that, because even if they succeed in clearing, they will be clearing district towns. I mean, if you look at what the British have achieved with, let's say, 7,000 troops in Helmand, which is, in effect, 4 district towns. In effect, they control Musakala, Sangin, Goreshk, and Lashkargah. Outside, they don't control anything. If you were to bring what General Petraeus has done, which is 3 times that number, I would imagine you might be able to, I mean, this is, of course, slightly ludicrous mathematics, but for the sake of argument, you would be able to control 12 district towns and not much of the regional countryside around. Most importantly of all, however, having cleared and held, how on earth does the building happen? Because the assumption that there somehow is this thing called sustainable economic development or sustainable legitimate economic development in Afghanistan, or good governance in Afghanistan, or that this is going to emerge in any kind of realistic time frame seems to be questionable. This is not the Viet Cong, right? This is the Taliban are a very fragile, fragmentary, curious, elusive group that I certainly don't understand, and I'm not sure many of us have a very clear view of. But I'm pretty clear that Mullah Muhammad Omar is not looking to come to the table, and that we don't have the carrots and sticks sufficient to drive him to that table. By and large, therefore, a counterinsurgency policy, full stop, in Afghanistan is a waste of time. We are not going to defeat the insurgency, however many troops we deploy, and that if we're going to keep soldiers in the country at all, we need to be thinking in a very, very different direction.